What happens when one man tries to watch all of the sci-fi films of the 1980s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 80s Project, Sci-Fi 1982. As I said in the last episode here, 1982 is by far one of the biggest and most significant years in sci-fi film history. And this block here it's going to back that up since we're looking at some of the coolest films of this era. So, let's just dive right in here and see what we have since we got some amazing views of our far future, which is now our recent past, other realms, and more than one animated adventure. We picked this back up on June 18th with the release of a sort of sci-fi, but also sort of action movie with Firefox. It begins with Harry Callahan on a little jog, and he's approached by a military helicopter, which gives him Vietnam flashbacks to when he was a POW, and they recruit him for a mission. The old guy from Crawlin', wow, I was unaware that Freddie Jones was the father of Toby Jones, and sure, I mean, they look pretty alike, but Jones is a common last name, so it's not like I feel dumb for not knowing that. It seems that we discovered that the Soviets had developed a brand new superplane called the Firefox, and if they're able to mass produce it, then they can take over the world. So it's decided to go ahead and steal it. Mitchell is brought in to do it since he can speak Russian, and he says no, but they pressure and blackmail him into doing it, and he takes on a false identity. He heads into Russia and luckily has some help from some dissident soldiers, and he tries to find his way into the airbase that holds the prototype Firefox. And as like a lot of the films he was in around this era, Eastwood also directed this one, and was probably the first one that had sci-fi overtones, and looking in his filmography, maybe the only one, unless I guess you count Space Cowboys. This one was based on a novel of the same name from 1977 and was sort of based on a real thing. There was a jet called the MiG-31 Firefox, and the book was based on that actual plane, but the film version took a lot of liberties and created something a little bit more high-tech and futuristic looking. Since the whole film essentially takes place in the Soviet Union, and Cold War tensions were really high at the time, they ended up filming in Austria and in the US. The budget it was given is disputed since some sources cite the total cost as being $21 million, although others say that the special effects alone cost $20 million. And I would guess that the rest of the production didn't just cost $1 million, so one of those numbers seems to be incorrect. It's notable for creating a new form of blue screen photography, developed by John Dykstra, which allowed for a more realistic look when it came to the shiny jet against a snowy background. Now, for the most part, it's not very sci-fi oriented until they get to the plane, and then there's some more fantastical elements, like a thought-controlled weapon system that he has to use while making sure to think in Russian. It didn't get good reviews, with most critics calling it a sort of James Bond tale without any of the charm or flavor of that series, and almost everyone coming down on the overall length of the film. So much so that afterwards, Eastwood went back to the well and cut the film down by 13 minutes, and that's the version that's mostly available now. It did make money, however, pulling in around $47 million at the box office. And even though there's a sequel to the novel and discussion for a film follow-up, nothing ever became of it. There was, however, a video game released for the Atari system, and the arcade version was pretty memorable since you flew in an 8-bit plane through actual video backgrounds. And I'm in agreement with those critics since I'm only giving this one 2 tapes out of 5 here. It's just so long and dull and lifeless. Its significance is the same since it definitely had recognition and had Eastwood involved, but it's not well remembered and didn't really change the genre all that much, if at all. Should you watch it? I mean, if this sort of thing is for you, I guess, but there's not much to it, and I think it's pretty skippable.
Check the tires and the windshield, will you?
Remember in the intro when I said that 1982 was a huge year for sci-fi? Well, here's where we prove it even further, because on June 25th, in the same month as Star Trek II and E.T., we got the release of Blade Runner. It has a text crawl that tells us that the Tyrell Corporation had created replicants, perfect human duplicates that were stronger and faster, and they were using them as slave labor. However, they decided that maybe it's not cool to be slaves and fought back, so replicants were made illegal, and they formed special police called Blade Runners to hunt them down and kill them. We then find out that it's set in the far-off distant future of 2019. Yeah, sorry guys, LA does not look like this. There's no flying cars, damn it, but I guess no big towers of flame either. Now, if you're watching the movie and not hearing Harrison Ford's voice, congratulations, you're not stuck with the theatrical version, but we'll talk about that in a bit. But we see Max Jenke being tested, which goes wrong when he's revealed to be a replicant and kills his tester. We then encounter Dr. Richard Kimball, who used to be a Blade Runner, and he's approached by Admiral Adama, who takes him to some guy who hates cans. He's told that he needs to hunt down 4 replicants that are on Earth now, and consists of Holden, but also a Hitcher, Eddie Valiant's girl, and a mermaid. He goes to meet Mr. Tyrell himself, who moonlights as a bartender at the Overlook, and the not quite the Catwoman, who turns out to be a replicant. From there, he has to try to hunt down the replicant crew and retire them, and this was Ridley Scott's follow-up to Alien. He broke into the mainstream pretty big with that one and was given a shot at adapting Dune, but when it seemed like that wasn't going to happen, he was offered an adaptation of Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and even though he had previously said no to it, he hopped on board. He probably regretted that shortly afterwards, since he and Harrison Ford quarreled non-stop on set. Neither one will talk about the specifics, but Scott had referred to Ford as being the biggest pain in the ass that he's ever had to work with. The director also had issues with Sean Young, and she claimed that he came on to her, and then she spurned him, which caused him to treat her unfairly on set. But that's not all, since it's said that Young and Ford didn't get along either, although that is, again, something that the details of which have never been divulged. It was so apparent that when they were meant to shoot their love scene together, the crew referred to it as their hate scene. But it looks like Ford's biggest bone of contention was that voiceover that I mentioned earlier, which the actor thought was completely unnecessary and said that before shooting, they had agreed to not do one. So when it came down to post-production, they had to basically drag him into the recording sessions. After it was completed, they did some test screenings, and negative comments led to the studio forcing Scott to add on a happy ending, which essentially contradicted most of what had already been said in the film. It was expensive, running a total of around $30 million, and for comparison, Star Trek II cost $12, and E.T. only cost $11. So this was more than both of those films combined. And, rather famously, much like John Carpenter's The Thing, it didn't do well at the box office. In its initial run, it only drew in $27 million, marking it as a box office bomb. And critics were pretty split on it, with some calling it a style over substance film, and others complaining about the slow pace. After 10 years passed, Scott was able to get the film re-released in a director's cut, which took out the disputed narration and got rid of that happy ending, but also restored a dream sequence featuring a unicorn, creating quite a bit of discussion as to whether or not Deckard himself was actually a replicant, and those continue to this day. Of course, over time, opinions on the film have really shifted, and it's now considered a sci-fi classic, and there's an abundance of media offshoots. There was an official sequel that arrived in 2017, and come on, it's silly that they didn't just wait 2 years and have it released in 2019, the year that the original film took place, but that was called Blade Runner 2049, so I guess expect Part 3 to arrive in 2047. There were also some short animated prequel films, an anime TV show, novels, and a possible TV show for Amazon Prime. And here's the interesting part, and a confession. I'm giving this a 4.5, and the confession is that I used to not like this movie at all. When I was younger, I just wasn't on board with it, and I found it to be empty. But over time, my appreciation has grown and grown, and I love it now. I wouldn't be surprised if it eventually became a 5 from me. And its sci-fi cultural significance is a 4, because again, much like The Thing, it's hard to give this a really high rank considering how badly it flopped, and it wasn't an influence at the time. Sure, it's now turned out to be very influential and is considered a big deal, but it's just never been a cultural zeitgeist. I mean, even the sequel ended up being a bit of a financial bust, so it's clear that it's not just some huge part of society. Should you watch it? Absolutely. Watch it before it's lost in time, like tears in rain.
Wake up! Time to die.
And it's no wonder the Blade Runner had a hard time at the box office, because it had to debut on the very same day, June 25th, as our next film, Mega Force. This one has Alligator's big game hunter Henry Silva as Guerrera, helping the nation of Gamibia attack their peaceful neighbor. We then meet Devin Miles meeting up in the desert with Megaforce, and one member wandered out of Xanadu. And Ilya is here too, but it's hard to recognize her with hair. Their base is hidden with holograms, and Dr. Detroit's dad is here too. Then the rest of the force of Mega arrives on these high-tech looking motorcycles and skin-tight outfits, and their leader is Brad Majors and Evan Kim, who was hilarious in Kentucky Fried Movie, and they have this massive underground facility, and the doc is testing out new stealth vehicles. And oh, they monitor every conversation in every military installation in the world? And yeah, nothing suspicious about that. Turns out that Guerrera and Ace used to be friends back in military school and have a long-standing rivalry, and their plan is to protect Sardin from the forces of Gamibia, so they head off on their mission. And this movie was a massive gamble. It was from Golden Harvest, the notable Chinese production studios known for a large number of action films from the 70s and 80s. They were riding high with marketing their films in the US ever since Enter the Dragon was a success, and started eyeing up making some movies exclusively directed at the Western market. They put up $20 million for the budget, and a good chunk of that went to the effects. A full $1 million went to the fancy cars and motorbikes that they have. Hal Needham was brought on to direct, and this mixture of action with comedy was right up his alley, since he was known for doing the Cannonball Run and the Smokey and the Bandit movies. He had wanted to cast Roger Moore since they had just worked together on Cannonball, and Tom Selleck and Michael Douglas were also both considered. It said that there were discussions with one actor for the role of Ace, and the film was meant to be more serious at that point, but instead they decided to go a more campy way, and saw Bostwick in a production of The Pirates of Penzance and knew that he was their guy.
The very model of a modern Major General.
One weird aspect is that there was no costume designer listed on the movie, and instead their uniforms were created by Mattel, the toy company, so that they could create the action figures for the film. However, the only thing that they ended up releasing were Hot Wheels, based on the cars and stuff. When it came out, it was savaged by critics, and still remains one of the films with a 0% score on Rotten Tomatoes, meaning not a single review for it was positive. It was also a huge bomb at the box office, making less than $6 million in its total run. In its opening weekend, it was in 9th place, way behind Blade Runner, another film that was said to underperform, and it was just barely beat out by John Carpenter's The Thing, which also debuted that weekend, and also bombed. Because of the low ticket sales, plans for a second film called Megaforce Deeds Not Words was cancelled, even though Bostwick was signed for a 3-picture deal. Two people that seemed to enjoy it quite a bit though were Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who have referenced it several times in South Park, and it appears as if Team America World Police is a sort of spoof on this movie, or at least aspects of it. And I'm going with a 2.5 here. This reminds me of Firefox, but the other side of the coin, in that it's also really dull sort of military intrigue that eventually leads to fun action stuff. But this one at least seems to know that it's cheesy and has a sense of humor about it. I wish that the camp was a little more frequent though, because that stuff's fun, but it's not enough. Its SFCS is a 2, since I feel that this one is one that people have heard of, but not many people have seen. Everyone seems to have seen the whole flying motorcycle bit, but not much else. Should you watch it? I mean, with all these other powerhouses around it, this is the one that you could likely pass on, but you won't be mad at yourself if you don't. Our next adventure takes us back over the ocean all the way to Japan as we head into July on the 3rd, and we get Space Adventure Cobra, the movie. It begins with a bounty hunter claiming a victim, which draws the attention of Cobra, a space pirate who rides a red motorbike. He follows her because he's smitten, and the head of her bounty comes to life and attacks them. Jane suspects the pirate guild of being behind the attack, and their crew shows up right after, and she reveals that she had been purposely looking for Cobra in order to get his help. It seems that her sister has been falsely accused of a crime and put in prison because of the guild, and Jane now needs Cobra's help in order to rescue her. Along the way, they encounter an old enemy of Cobra's named Crystal Bowie, and he says that he failed to kill him 3 previous times, and they go in for the save, along with Cobra's robot assistant, Lady Armoroid. Soon, though, it seems that things aren't as they appear, and double-crossing is in the cards, leading to some good old-fashioned revenge missioning. And this was an adaptation of a very popular Japanese manga from 1978, simply called Cobra. The film version basically adapted the first storyline fairly faithfully, and the character is often referred to as being like a little James Bond and a whole lot of Han Solo. It eventually was released in the US in 1995 in a dubbed form, and later released on home video as well. After this, the character would then graduate to his own animated series, which ran for over 30 episodes between 82 and 83, and then would later be revived for another series called Cobra, the Animation, in 2008. There's also considerable more adventures in manga form, and of course, some video games as well. The film version was met with a mixed reaction, but it soon became one of the most recognized Japanese anime imports in the US. The character got a little extra boost in 1991 when Matthew Sweet featured a good chunk of this film in his video for Girlfriend, and that went into massive rotation on MTV. So even if you've never seen or heard of this movie, there's a good chance that you're pretty familiar with what you're seeing on screen here. And I'll give this one a 3.5. It's a lot of fun. It's a pretty crazy adventure, and something is always going on, so it sure as hell ain't boring. Its significance is a 2, since I feel like it's one of the more well-known anime films, but I still don't think that it's widely seen, and certainly didn't really impact the genre here. This likely has a much bigger significance in Japan, but here it's just a 2. Should you watch it? Yeah, let this Cobra bite you. Next up on this cavalcade of, oh man, all this came out around the same time, is this one that came out on July 9th, and it's Tron. It begins in an arcade as someone is playing a video game with light cycles, but we can see that inside the game there's actual people, and one of them is evil, like from Time Bandits, but he's also evil like he's the villain. Billy the Kid is a program in the game, as is Ayando Malari, but up in the real world there's also this guy, the Dude, and he's trying to hack into the mainframe of a company called Encom. One of the higher-ups there, a guy named Dillinger, is basically the human avatar of Sark from the computer world, and he literally talks to the computer, and they know that Flynn is looking for some sort of hidden file that not even the MCP can find. There's also a programmer named Alan, and he's another Babylon 5er, and he says that he's working on a new security program called Tron. They're also working on a new laser that digitizes things to upload into the mainframe, and Grandpa is a long way from Santa Carla. And Lacey Underall is here. And when I watched this video to write this script, it was 2 days after hearing of Cindy Morgan's passing away. Turns out that Flynn had developed a video game with Encom, but Dillinger stole his product, which is what Flynn has been looking for. He, Alan, and Laura break into Encom to try to find that file, so the MCP activates the laser and sends him into the game grid, digitizing him. There, he sees the gladiatorial-style games like the disc game and a sort of highlight, and he also encounters Tron, who looks just like Alan since he programmed him, and they try to figure out how to bring down Sark and the MCP. And this was a bit of an experiment at the time, and for sure, no other film from the era looks like this, and it's one of the very first films to use extensive computer-generated animation. It was developed and eventually directed by Steven Lisberger, who had only worked in animation before this, and only directed a film called Animalympics, which was another film that if you had HBO in the 80s, you've seen. After seeing Pong back in '76, Lisberger decided to try to make an animated film about a video game character. He eventually decided to mix the animation with live action elements to create something that's never been seen before and shopped it around, and eventually Disney agreed to make it. Originally, they had wanted Robin Williams to play Flynn since the original script was more comedic, but after some revisions, it became more serious. Upon release, it was sort of a mixed bag. The reviews were actually pretty good, and critics really enjoyed the unique visual style and inventiveness. And it came out on a weekend that, unlike some of the other movies that we're talking about here, didn't have any of the other powerhouses come out to compete with it. But E.T. was still a thing, so Tron debuted at number 2, and its opening weekend was a little less than 5 million, far less than number 1 E.T.'s 12 million from the same weekend. In fact, Tron's take wasn't much higher than the number 3 movie, Rocky III, which had been out for 7 weeks. The good thing is that it would go on to pull in around 33 million overall. Since the budget was only 17 million, it was seen as a small success, but they were expecting much bigger totals, so it was viewed as a disappointment. It made headlines later in the year when the Academy refused to allow it to be nominated for a Best Special Effects Award because they had said that using computers was cheating, which is pretty ironic from a 2024 standpoint. And I guess I don't know if ironic is the right word, but you know what I mean. Over time, though, the film proved to be pretty influential, especially with computer animators, and essentially launched Pixar with John Lasseter, head of Disney's animation group, saying that without Tron, there would be no Toy Story. Much later in 2010, there would be a sequel release called Tron Legacy that brought back Bridges and Boxleitner, which was also a success, but again, not quite as big of one as was expected. There was also a 19-episode animated series that ran from 2012 to 2013 called Tron Uprising that played on Disney XD, and a third film, tentatively titled Tron Eras, is said to be in the works, although that's been going on for a while, and even though they swear it's in the production stages, it's not clear if it's actually happening, or if it's just like a digital dream. And I like Tron fine, I guess, but it's not that great. I give it a 3.5. I love the look, and the visual aspects are awesome, but the story is still a little stilted and feels a touch empty. Its significance is a 4, though, since it was very influential in the animation world, and its work with computer animation pushed the art form forward, even if the film itself was never the cultural juggernaut that they were hoping it to be. Should you watch it? Yep, pop in a quarter and give it a play. On July 16th, we get another animated entry, although one from the US, and it's The Secret of Nim. It introduces us to a talking mouse named Mrs. Brisby, and she seeks the help of Mr. Ages, another talking mouse, because her son is sick, and it's said that he has pneumonia and has to stay in bed for 3 weeks. There's also a talking bird named Jeremy, voiced by Dun Dun Dun, Captain Chaos, and they're chased by the local cat, Dragon. She has some other children with voices from a very young Will Wheaton and Shannon Doherty, but then we hear the farmer discuss NIM, the National Institute of Mental Health, and they asked if there's anything unusual with the rats nearby. But when the farmer decides to plow his field early, they have to figure out what to do since they can't move little Timothy, and she asks the Great Owl for advice. And he's voiced by John Carradine, and told to seek out the rat named Nicodemus for help in moving her house.
You lazy kitty. Go catch some of those rats out in the barn. Never seen a cat sleep so much.
I mean, have you seen a cat before? She eventually makes it to the rats, where she meets Justin, the dashing leader of the guard, Jenner, the manipulative, power-mad one, and finally their leader, Nicodemus himself. Because the rats were helped greatly by her late husband, they agree to help her move, and even though this looks like Disney, it's not, by Don Bluth, who is essentially a former Disney worker who went out on his own and became the foremost competition for the Mouse's animated works. This was his first full feature, but he'd go on to do An American Tail, All Dogs Go to Heaven, The Land Before Time, and also did the animation for The Dragon's Lair and Space Ace video games. This one was based on a children's book called Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim, and Disney had a chance to adapt it, but passed, so Bluth decided to make it his first feature. He used a bunch of former animators for the Mouse House, and they set up their own independent studio. They made some changes to the original story, the most obvious being Mrs. Frisbee's name in order to avoid a lawsuit from Wham-O over the name Frisbee, although the change came after all the recording had already been completed, so they had to go in and re-record any time that someone said the character's name. In the case of John Carradine, he wasn't available to do so, so it was necessary to do some creative sound editing to make it work. Another big change was the addition of magical fantasy elements to the story, whereas the original book was a more focused sci-fi turn of events. It got a pretty nice reception from critics, with people praising the animation and somewhat deeper plot than was standard at the time, and even won the Saturn Award for Best Animated Film of the Year. It did okay, earning around $15 million against a $7 million budget, which was a decent profit for a smaller scale project, but really earned money in the home video release and helped springboard Bluth into more features. It got a straight-to-video sequel in 1998 with The Secret of Nim 2, Timmy to the Rescue, but Bluth wasn't involved, and it was pretty quickly forgotten. There were recent discussions of a remake or a TV series, with it being put forth as a live-action version, but no movement has been made on anything in a few years, so it's likely dead. And I love this. It's a 4 from me. This is a cool story that's not quite as adult as Watership Down, but feels more mature than your standard Disney fare. Call it nostalgia, but this movie's always had a special place in my heart. Its significance is a 3.5 since it was popular, but mostly on a cult level, but it did launch animation competition for Disney and made Bluth a known name. Should you watch it? Yeah, I mean, sure, it's a cartoon, but it's a damn good one. It's time to get international again, because on July 16th, in West Germany, there was the release of Kamakazi 1989, which got a US screening in '83. It takes place in the near future of 1989, a mere 7 years from when it was shot, and it said that the world is sort of a utopia, with no hunger, no pollution, and no unemployment. However, there's also no drinking, no drugs, no homegrown foods, and one TV channel. There's a police officer named Jansen, played by the legendary Rainer Werner Fassbinder. This guy was the man who was the main catalyst of the new German cinema movement and used a variety of avant-garde filmmaking techniques to explore the aftermath of a post-war Germany. Outside of writing and directing, he also acted in assorted projects, and this would be his final role before his death. In fact, he passed away shortly before this film premiered of an overdose and had been struggling with addiction for years. Jansen is called in because of a terroristic bomb threat to a massive corporation head known as the Blue Panther, which I imagine would have been the Asylum knockoff title of the Black Panther, so they missed the boat on that one. When the expected explosion doesn't happen, it's up to Jansen to investigate, and he's given 4 days. And along with Anton here, they get to work. Pretty soon there's death threats, suicides, and the mystery of what's going on the 31st floor of the corporate headquarters. And the director here is Wolf Grimm, and almost all of his work was in Germany, and never made the jump to working in American films, or even having his films widely released here. He was good friends with Fassbinder, which accounts for his appearance here, and his work was very acclaimed in his home country. The music for the film has a very Tangerine Dream kind of feel, and that's because it was by Edgar, I think it's Frost, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct, founding member of that band, and this appears to be the only soundtrack that he did as a solo artist. And I'm giving this a 3. This one was interesting and kind of fun at times, but it was very hard for me to get into as I am unaware of the political elements that it is satirizing. Its significance is just a 1 because this is practically virtually unknown here. It's probably more significant in Germany where the film was created, but here it does not have that going for it. Should you watch it? Yeah, I mean, it's worth a shot. It's actually entertaining at times. It's not great, but it's definitely probably worth a watch. It looks like we're staying in the world of animation quite a bit in this block, and also spending some time out of the US, because in France, The Masters of Time was released, and it wouldn't get a US release until 1984. It has this space vehicle on some sort of remote planet, and it gets into a crash. Little PL walks away from it, but his dad is stuck in the wreckage, and gives him this egg thing named Mike, before it's swarmed by killer hornets and explodes. Meanwhile, up in space, the guy that they were calling on the radio, Jafar, gets this message, and they realize that they have to go and help get the kid. He's got a prince and princess along with him and decides to recruit his friend Silbad since he spent time on that planet. He's able to give the young guy advice on how to survive there until they can get to him, but it's pretty funny because they sure don't seem to be in a rush. They take time to hang out, they go swimming, watch some of the life forms of that world reproduced. It's just generally chill. The creepy prince tries to convince the kid to kill himself, but it's prevented by Belle. And they're at least finally on their way to the rescue. They have to detour onto a nearby planet and find these winged, faceless men, and it's sort of just a string of their adventures. And this is basically another animated film that's based upon a book, this one called The Orphan of Perdide by Stefan Wolf. It's directed by René Laloux, who had previously directed the just insane animated film Fantastic Planet in 1973, and if you like weird films, then I strongly recommend that one. It's a trip. But this would be his first time in the director's role since then, so almost a 10-year gap. And he brought legendary French artist Mobius to come on and do all the design work. He had already been involved in some films, as he did some design work for Alien and several other films, but this is closer to his particular style. There was quite a bit of difficulty in the production since it was a joint work between France and Hungary, and there was a language barrier between the two staffs. The Hungarian animation staff felt the stress of the work environment, particularly when Laloux continually would change the concepts for their film, and there's reports that they would often break down into tears. And even though it never quite reached the levels of success that Fantastic Planet did, it still achieved a bit of cult success, particularly in the UK and France. And like Kamakazi, I also give this one a 3. It has quite a bit to enjoy, but the plot itself just kind of wanders all over the place, and you kind of just, you're saying the whole time, come on, get to the planet. Its significance is also a 1 because it is very not known here. This is a very obscure film, and again, possibly has more significance in its home countries, but here, not so much. Should you watch it? Yeah, I mean, it's worth a shot. It's a fun animation, has some cool stuff happening, but overall, it could probably be skipped, but I don't know, it's still kind of fun. Buckle up because it's about to get weird, because in August, in Canada, there was the world premiere of the film Liquid Sky. It would get a US theatrical run a little later in April of '83, but it first debuted at the Montreal World Film Festival. It starts in New York as a UFO enters the sky and lands on the roof of an apartment building. It goes into the apartment of Margaret, who works in a nightclub, and one night, as she hooks up with Jimmy, who is mainly interested in finding drugs, and it's told in this very fractured style, intercut with Paul here, a writer who's addicted to heroin. And Margaret's girlfriend is Adrian, who also works at the club. And when trying to score cocaine from a guy, he tries to force himself on her and attacks her in a stairwell, leaving her unconscious. We also meet Johan and Owen, a scientist and college professor who have spotted the UFO and have been watching it and also photographed it. But then there's also Jimmy's mother, who works in television and lives across the way from Margaret. And again, this is all told in a very fragmented manner, cutting back and forth in between their conversations. And everyone is kind of tied together since Owen is Margaret's professor, who she is also sleeping with. And things get weird when he seems dead, but then has this crystal in his head which she removes, only for it to vanish. And this slice of insanity was brought to us by Slava Sukerman, a Russian director, and this would be his first feature film. He directed several shorts and TV movies during the 70s for Israel and then moved to New York, and this would be his first film in the States. It was shot independently for around $500,000, and it was an altered version of the script that he had written called Sweet 16. He and his wife decided to alter it to try to make it more marketable and included actress Anne Carlisle, who would go on to play Margaret in the writing process. So, keep in mind, this was the more marketable version of this script. It was filmed guerrilla style without permits, and a good chunk of it was simply shot in Carlisle's actual New York apartment. But Carlisle didn't just play Margaret. If you didn't notice earlier, she also plays Jimmy, a dual role that wasn't intended. The actor who was meant to play that role dropped out right before filming, or very early in the process, and they simply had Carlisle do both parts. Its debut at the Montreal Film Festival was rather auspicious since it took the jury award there, and would then go on to become a festival darling, and was pretty critically acclaimed. It would play a number of theaters in the midnight circuit, turning into a solid cult hit and bringing in around $1.7 million, a solid profit for an independent feature. It would become an underground sensation, significantly for its visual and fashion styling, and several years later, Carlisle would be inspired to write a novelization. Back in 2014, Sukerman had been discussing making a sequel called simply Liquid Sky 2, with Carlisle returning as Margaret, although there's been no word on it since, so it's assumed to be a dead project. And I give this one a 3.5. This movie is just a mood. It's a sort of style overload, which is a slight detriment too, because it does feel a bit empty at times and care more about the look than anything else. But I do really dig it. I wish the music was better. The soundtrack really could have boosted this a big deal. Its significance is a 2.5 because I feel like this is pretty well known, but only among a very small subset of people. It's a very niche film, but it's huge in that niche. Should you watch it? Sure, take a hit.
What is going on? What's going on? Why are they all being so mean?
This block ends in a truly epic manner with a film that was released in August 16th in a limited capacity, but went wider on the 20th, and it's The Beastmaster. It begins in a mystical kingdom called Eruk, and Zed is here as a high priest named Mayax, and he discovers that there's a prophecy that the son of, Zed. This character is actually called Zed. And he's the king, and it's said his son will kill Mayax, so he has one of his witches kidnap it and then kill it. But it's saved by a random villager. He takes it in and raises it, not knowing its actual heritage, and it grows into Buddy, who's not yet one of the guys, and he can talk to the animals. Soon he's fully grown and is now Mike Donovan, and since this is a sordid sorcery flick, there's only one way that it can begin. A group of marauders show up to wipe out his village, killing everyone and his dog to show that they're real monsters. He heads out in search of his destiny, teaming up with an eagle named Sharek, and he talks to it. And why do I think that this sound means nothing in eagle language? And the bird is all like, Jesus, dude, you just said the word cramnock in my language, which means nothing. Just like in yours. And you said it with a freaking hawk accent. He also encounters two ferrets, Kodo and Podo, but he just talks to them in English, not some weird chittering noise. The final member of his menagerie is a black tiger that he calls Ra. On the way to find the Juns, he encounters Sheena, a slave girl, and then those freaky birdmen that can just sort of like liquefy you. And then winds up in the path of Mayax once again and has to save Kiri, stop the Juns, and fulfill his prophecy, which seems like just a lot. Thankfully, the owner of McDowell's is here to help, and he has Tal with him, who says that Kiri is his cousin, but he also says that he's the son of King Zed. So, follow me here. Tal is the son of Zed. Tal and Kiri are cousins. Dar is also the son of Zed, but with a different mother. So he and Tal are half-brothers. That means that unless Kiri is the daughter of the king's wife's sister, her and Dar are cousins. And she's the romantic lead for our hero. And they had a deleted sex scene. And this is from one of my favorite directors, Don Coscarelli, creator of the Phantasm series, and Bubba Hotep, and yes, Beastmaster. This was the film that he did right after the first Phantasm's huge success, and he co-wrote this as well. It was sort of based on a novel from 1959 called The Beastmaster, but the story was altered so much that the book's author asked to have his name removed from it. They raised up $9 million for the budget, Coscarelli's biggest at the time, and while casting, the director wanted Demi Moore to play Kiri, but was overruled, and they cast Tanya Roberts instead. They also tried to get Klaus Kinski for Mayax, but he proved to be too expensive. The toughest cast members, though, were the animals. Ra was meant to be a black tiger, or I suppose maybe a black panther, but it's clearly a tiger, but it was a regular tiger, simply dyed black. Now, there's a rather pervasive story on the internet that the tiger died due to reaction to the paint, but that's not exactly true, although a tiger did die. Coscarelli stated that the film's executive producer brought in an animal handler who chose to dye more than one tiger black. In order to do this, they had to anesthetize them. When they were done, one of the tigers simply never woke up from the anesthetic, which is a known problem with cats. Coscarelli was really upset about the death. Also, the eagle wouldn't fly when it was meant to fly, so they resorted to taking it up in a hot air balloon and then simply dropped it down from a trapdoor and filmed it flying away. The reviews were mediocre, and so was the box office since it only brought in $14 million during its run. However, afterwards, Beastmaster would go on to become a massive staple on the home market, to the point that it was a common joke that HBO stood for, "Hey, Beastmaster's on." Almost a decade later, in 1991, a sequel would arrive with Beastmaster 2 through the portal of time that brought the character to modern-day Los Angeles, and would return in 1996 with Beastmaster 3, The Eye of Braxis. There was also a TV show that ran for 3 seasons from 1999 to 2002, which recast the main character, although Mark Singer would show up in the 3rd season as a different character. And I just adore this movie. It's a 4 from me. I know it's not perfect, and it's goofy, but this is what I'm looking for from fun sword and sorcery. Its significance is a 3 since it's pretty widely known, and I feel like most people have seen it and know it, but I don't really think it impacted the genre that much, and it didn't really catch on as a cultural mainstay. Should you watch it? Yes, do it for Kodo and Podo. So there you have it, the sci-fi of the summer of '82. I feel like most of these films were in a pretty short block of time here, and a lot of straight sci-fi in this block, as well as some fantasy. And my favorite of this block is going to be Blade Runner. I mean, I think that's pretty easy, but let me know which of these was your favorite down below. Let me know which one of these you've seen, which one of these you'd now like to see. If you enjoyed this video, of course, also hit the like button, and if you enjoy the channel, maybe hit the subscribe button and get the bell to get notifications of when new videos come out. Check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines, where you can help support the project to keep the channel going. And yeah, I'll see you very shortly because we're going to keep on going. always keep on going because there's lots more movies to watch right here on the 80s Project.